Thornwood Rebellion, Ancient Forest Spirits versus Industrial Magic Expansion. The screaming woke her. Not the kind mortals made that brief, wet sound before silence claimed them. This was deeper, older, the voice of heartwood splitting under poison, of roots writhing as acid ate through bark and bone alike. Bramble Ironbark's consciousness clawed its way up through centuries of tree sleep, each layer of awakening bringing fresh agony. Her oak, the vessel that had housed her spirit for 800 winters, convulsed around her essence like a dying animal. Black veins spiderwebbed across the ancient bark, weeping a substance that stank of sulfur and screaming metal. She forced herself to manifest, her dryad form emerging from the trunk in a cascade of dying leaves. Where once her skin had been the warm brown of healthy earth, now it bore the same sickly pallor as her corrupted tree, the forest around her. Gods below and roots between. The thornwood was dying. Streams that had run clear and cold for millennia now flowed the color of rust and rage. The very air tasted of copper pennies and burnt offerings to some industrial god she didn't recognize. Ancient oaks, her kin, stood skeletal against a sky choked with smoke that moved wrong, too thick, too eager to cling to living things. What have they done? The words scraped from her throat like bark against bark. What have the little builders done to my forest? A sound answered her, the mechanical shriek of metal teeth biting stone, accompanied by the bass rumble of engines that ran on more than mere fuel. Magic crackled in the air, but it was wrong magic, twisted, hungry in ways that made her essence recoil. She followed the sound, each step through the corrupted underbrush sending fresh waves of nausea through her connection to the dying wood. Thorns that should have recognized her as kin now drew blood from her bark-rough skin. Even the stones seemed to flinch away from her touch. The mining camp sprawled like an infection across what had once been the whispering glade. Massive machines, part metal, part condensed spellwork, tore at the earth with methodical violence. The magical drills screamed as they burrowed deeper, their crystalline cores pulsing with light that hurt to look at directly. Each pulse sent ripples of corruption outward, turning fertile soil to ash, healthy trees to blackened husks. And overseeing it all, humans, so many humans. Bramble pressed herself against a dying elm, feeling its pain echo through her bones. The workers moved with the efficiency of insects, their faces hidden behind breathing apparatus that made them look like the gas-masked harbingers of some mechanical apocalypse. They spoke in the clipped, practical language of the industrial age: tonnage, extraction rates, profit margins. Ferris, get over here. The voice belonged to a man whose expensive coat couldn't quite hide the cruel efficiency in his movements. Director Ashton Grimwold, according to the whispers in the wind. His magical extractor crews deferred to him with the kind of fear usually reserved for apex predators. The man who answered, Ferris Coalwright, the foreman, looked different from the others. Where they moved with the mechanical precision of cogs in a machine, he carried himself like someone who still remembered what it felt like to be human. His hands, when he removed his work gloves, were stained with earth rather than just oil and metal shavings. We're ahead of schedule on the eastern extraction, Ferris reported, but something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely pleased about it. The magical resonance is higher than projected. Whatever's down there, it's significant. Grimwold's smile was the kind that preceded atrocities. Excellent. The consortium will be pleased. Double the shifts. I want those deep veins exposed by month's end. Sir, the workers are reporting irregularities, claims about moving trees, voices in the wind. Maybe we should. Superstition. Grimwold's voice could have frozen flame. Increase security if it makes them feel better, but those drills don't stop. We're extracting enough raw thaumic energy to power half the continent. A few spooked miners won't derail this operation. Ferris nodded, but his eyes lingered on the dying forest with something that might have been regret or recognition. Bramble watched him walk away, noting how he paused to touch the bark of a blackened birch gently, like someone saying goodbye to an old friend. The gesture sparked something dangerous in her chest. Hope, the most poisonous emotion of all. She was considering her next move when the rust sprites found her. They had once been brownies, she realized with growing horror. Forest spirits no taller than her forearm, whose job had been to tend the small magics, helping seeds find good soil, guiding lost creatures home, maintaining the delicate balance between growth and decay. Now they moved in jerky mechanical motions, their organic curves replaced by harsh angles of corroded metal. Where their eyes had been, crimson lights flickered with malevolent intelligence. Dryad Queen Mother Tree Singer, their voices harmonized in a sound like grinding gears. Join us, accept the iron gift, become more than flesh. Never. The word came out as a growl, backed by 8 centuries of accumulated fury. They attacked as one, their small forms suddenly lethal, claws that had once been used for gardening now sharp enough to part steel. Bramble met them with her own claws, bark-hard fingernails that could rend stone, but found herself fighting defensively. They were faster than they should be, stronger, and completely without the self-preservation instincts that kept most forest creatures alive. One latched onto her arm, its metallic teeth seeking the green blood that flowed beneath her bark skin. She grabbed it by what remained of its head and squeezed, feeling the corruption fight against her natural magic. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of the creature. It had been terrified, alone, crying for help that never came. Then it was gone, crumbling to rust and regret between her fingers. The others pressed their attack with renewed fury, but Bramble had had enough of being prey. She reached out with her power, calling to every root, every branch, every thorn within reach. The forest answered slowly, painfully, but it answered. Vines erupted from the corrupted soil, their movements sluggish but determined. They wrapped around the rust sprites like the embrace of a dying mother, holding them still while Bramble's claws found their mark. One by one, the twisted creatures fell, their metallic forms returning to the earth that had birthed them. But their death screams had been heard. Alarms began to wail throughout the mining camp. Searchlights swept the forest edge, their beams revealing the carnage she had wrought. Men shouted orders, weapons powered up with the distinctive whine of military-grade spellwork. Bramble stood among the bodies of the corrupted brownies, her chest heaving with exertion and rage. The forest pressed against her consciousness, sharing its pain, its fury, its desperate desire for vengeance. Every poisoned stream, every blackened tree, every creature twisted beyond recognition, all of it flowed through her, demanding action. She looked at the mining camp, at the machines that ate the earth's magic and vomited back corruption, at the humans who thought themselves clever enough to harness forces they couldn't begin to understand. Time to teach them differently. The forest was fighting back. Ferris Coalwright had seen a lot of things in 15 years of industrial mining cave-ins that defied physics, equipment that ran for weeks on fumes, ores that glowed with their own inner light. But he'd never seen trees walk. The thing that had been a centuries-old oak now stood on roots thick as pythons, its remaining branches reaching toward the mining equipment like the arms of a dying god seeking vengeance. Where its bark had split, golden sap wept in patterns that hurt to look at, directly ancient script that predated human writing by millennia. Elder Oakenheart spoke in a voice like wind through autumn leaves, each word carrying the weight of seasons beyond count. Your machines drink deep of our lifeblood, little builder. Do you taste our deaths in your extracted magics? Captain Steelborn, the military commander Grimwold had brought in to handle the situation, laughed with all the warmth of grinding metal. It talks, how quaint. He gestured to his squad of combat mages, their staffs already crackling with suppression spells. Light it up. Wait, Ferris started forward, but stopped when Steelborn's cold eyes fixed on him. Problem, foreman. Yeah, he had a problem. Several, actually. Like how his grandmother used to tell stories about the old spirits before the Industrial Revolution made such tales obsolete. Like how the forest had been singing until the magical extractors started running. Like how the very air tasted of grief and rage and something that might have been justice, if justice came with thorns and fury. The entity isn't threatening anyone, Ferris said carefully. Maybe we could. Entity? Oakenheart's voice rose to a roar that shook leaves from branches 3 valleys over. I am elder of the eastern reaches, guardian of the deep root network, singer of the seasonal songs. Your metal parasites have murdered my children for their life essence, and you call me Entity. The treant's massive form took a step forward, each footfall causing the ground to shake. Suppression spells sparked off his bark like rain off stone, doing no more damage than harsh language. Steelborn's response was to call up a flame lance, its tip burning white-hot with concentrated fire magic. Stand down, or we will cut you down like any other tree. Oakenheart's laughter was the sound of a forest fire just beginning to catch. Cut me down, child of smoke and steel. Do you know how long I have stood in this place? I remember when your species first learned to nap flint. I watched your cities rise from mud and ambition. I will watch them fall back to dust and memory. That's when Myra Thornfield stepped between them. The environmental mage wasn't impressive to look at: average height, unremarkable features, clothes that suggested she spent more time in libraries than battlefields. But when she raised her hand, both the military-grade spell work and the ancient forest magic paused like children caught fighting by their mother. Enough! Her voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with understanding. Captain, your suppression spells are making the magical corruption worse. Every time you try to bind the forest's power, you force it through the contaminated ley lines. She turned to address the treant with the kind of respect usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Elder Oakenheart, the humans don't understand what they're doing. They see resources where you see family, profit where you see sacred trust. Understanding is not required for guilt, the treant replied, but his roots had stopped their aggressive posturing. They poison our waters, corrupt our children, feast on our deaths. What more is there to understand? Myra pulled out a device that looked like a cross between a compass and a musical instrument, its crystalline core pulsing with soft light. The magical pollution isn't just killing your forest. It's creating a cascade effect that will spread across 3 kingdoms. The extractors are pulling raw thaumic energy through natural channels that were never meant to carry that much power. She looked directly at Ferris, her green eyes holding depths that suggested she saw more than most people would be comfortable with. The mining operation is turning the forest's own magic against it. Every extraction makes the corruption stronger. Ferris felt something cold settle in his stomach. How long do we have? Before the cascade becomes irreversible, maybe 6 months, maybe less. Her expression was grim. The rust sprites were just the beginning. The longer this continues, the more of the natural spirits will be twisted into something else. As if summoned by her words, shapes began moving through the diseased underbrush. More rust sprites, but these were larger, more elaborate in their corruption. Where the first wave had been twisted brownies, these looked like they had once been dryads, their graceful forms now angular nightmares of living metal and dying wood. See how your gifts transform us. Oakenheart's voice carried notes of grief that made Ferris's chest tight. They were my granddaughters, singers of the dawn chorus. Now listen to their new song. The corrupted dryads opened their mouths and screamed, a sound like industrial machinery trying to reproduce music and failing in the most horrific way possible. The noise was so wrong, so fundamentally opposed to the natural order, that even Steelborn's hardened soldiers took a step back. That's when Bramble Ironbark hit them from behind. She came through the canopy like nature's own missile, 800 years of accumulated fury focused into claws and thorns and absolute, murderous intent. Her first target was a combat mage whose suppression staff had been particularly effective. She landed on his shoulders and rode him down, her claws finding the gaps in his armor with surgical precision. The man's scream cut off abruptly. "Contact rear," Steelborn spun, bringing his flame lance to bear, but Bramble was already moving. She rolled off the corpse and came up in a crouch, her form seeming to blend with the shadows between trees. When she moved, it was like watching a forest cat stalk prey, fluid, predatory, absolutely lethal. "Sister-daughter Furyborn," Oakenheart called to her, "the battle has begun without you." Bramble's response was a smile that belonged on something with too many teeth. "Then, let's make sure it ends properly." The fight that followed was less a battle than a natural disaster with personal grudges. Bramble moved through the military formation like wildfire through dry grass, her claws finding flesh, while her power called up thorns from the corrupted earth. The soldiers' technological advantages meant nothing when the ground itself was trying to kill them. But it was the corrupted Dryads that truly turned the tide. They fell upon their former guardians' enemies with mechanical precision, their metallic forms shrugging off spell fire while their claws parted steel like silk. Within minutes, Steelborn's elite squad was reduced to screaming, scattered remnants fleeing back toward the mining camp. Ferris found himself pressed against a dying pine, watching the carnage with a mixture of horror and something that might have been satisfaction. These were his people dying, humans he'd worked alongside, shared meals with, complained about the weather with. But they were also the people responsible for turning a living forest into this poisoned wasteland. When Bramble's eyes found his, he expected to see his death in them. Instead, he saw a question. She approached slowly, her claws retracted but ready, blood that belonged to several different species dripping from her fingers. "You didn't run." It wasn't an accusation, more like curiosity. "Wouldn't have made it 50 feet, Ferris replied honestly. "Besides, someone needs to witness this." "Witness?" "What we've done here, what you're doing about it." He gestured toward the mining camp, where emergency lights were beginning to flicker on. "Grimwold's not going to stop. The consortium has too much invested in this operation." Bramble's expression was unreadable. "And you, are you going to stop?" The question hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. Ferris looked at the corrupted forest, at the dying streams, at the rust sprites that had once been innocent woodland creatures. He thought about his pension, his career, his comfortable life built on the systematic extraction of magic from the natural world. Then he thought about his grandmother's stories, about forests that sang, about spirits that tended the wild places with gentle hands and ancient wisdom. "Yeah," he said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "Yeah, I think I am." Bramble nodded once, then melted back into the diseased underbrush like she had never been there at all, but her voice lingered. "Then you'd better hope we win, Foreman, because if we lose, there won't be a world left worth saving." The war machines arrived at dawn, their spell cores humming with enough concentrated destruction to level mountains. Ferris watched them roll into position from his hiding spot among the corrupted thorns, each vehicle a testament to humanity's talent for turning magic into implements of mass murder. The Devastator-class extractors looked like mechanical spiders crossed with industrial cathedrals, all angles and aggressive intent, their crystalline cores pulsing with barely contained thaumic energy. Behind them came the flame tanks, their crews protected behind wards that shimmered like heat mirages. But it was the thing they brought last that made his blood freeze. A scorched earth unit, its barrel thick enough to walk through, designed for one purpose only: complete magical sterilization. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Director Grimwold appeared beside him, seemingly from nowhere, his expensive coat now supplemented by military-grade protective enchantments. Consortium R&D's latest breakthrough. It doesn't just kill vegetation, it burns out the magical essence of the land itself. Nothing will ever grow here again. Ferris forced his expression to remain neutral, though inside he was screaming. Seems thorough. Oh, it is. We're going to turn this entire forest into a crater, then extract every trace of thaumic energy from the exposed ley lines. The profit margins are extraordinary. Grimwald's smile was the kind that preceded genocides. Your grandmother would have called it progress, don't you think? The casual mention of family made Ferris's jaw clench. My grandmother would have called it an abomination. Would she now? Grimwald's tone remained pleasant, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. How interesting. And here I thought you were a company man. Before Ferris could respond, the forest answered for him. Every tree within a mile radius began to move. Not the slow, stately movement of Oakenheart's approach, but the violent thrashing of creatures in mortal agony. Branches whipped through the air like artillery shells, roots erupted from the ground in waves, and the very air filled with the sound of creaking wood and snapping bark, amplified 1,000-fold. At the center of it all, Bramble Ironbark rose from the earth like fury given form. She had changed since their last encounter. The corruption that poisoned the forest had spread through her as well, but instead of twisting her into mechanical horror, it seemed to have refined her rage into something approaching art. Her bark skin now bore veins of silver that pulsed with her heartbeat, and when she moved, reality rippled around her like water disturbed by a stone. Enough. Her voice echoed from every tree, every stone, every drop of poisoned water in the forest. It was the sound of nature itself finally losing patience with the small, clever creatures that had forgotten their place in the world. The first devastator to open fire simply stopped existing. One moment it was there, its magical drill boring into the earth with mechanical determination. The next, the space it had occupied was filled with nothing but twisted metal and the screams of its operators. Bramble had reached out with her power and convinced the machine's own spells that they belonged somewhere else, somewhere incompatible with continued existence. Target the Dryad, Grimwald screamed over his comm unit. All units focus fire on. His words were cut off as Bramble looked directly at him. Just looked. But in that gaze was the promise of death delivered slowly, over seasons, with the patient cruelty of a drought that lasted years. The flame tanks opened fire, their weapons painting the air with superheated destruction. But the forest was ready for them. Ancient oaks bent like dancers, letting the flames pass harmlessly overhead. The fire that did connect simply sank into bark that had survived countless natural blazes, absorbed and neutralized. Then the trees began to fight back. Ferris had seen combat footage from the border wars, watched mages duel with spells that could crack fortress walls. None of it had prepared him for the sight of a forest at war. Roots thick as building supports erupted from the ground to crush tank treads. Branches moved with predatory intelligence, seeking the soft spots in armor, the gaps in magical shields. And everywhere, the sound of wood striking metal, of nature reclaiming its stolen children through violence. But the humans weren't defenseless. Combat mages wove suppression spells that turned living wood brittle, made sap run backward, forced leaves to wither at the touch. The devastators that survived Bramble's initial assault began systematic deforestation, their drills adapted to bore through heartwood as easily as stone. It was Myra who found Ferris cowering behind the ruins of an overturned extractor. "We have to stop this," she shouted over the chaos. "The magical feedback is creating a cascade resonance. If it reaches critical mass..." "The whole kingdom dies," Ferris finished. He'd seen the projections, knew what happened when thaumic energy reached unstable levels. "How do we stop it?" "The scorched earth cannon," Myra pointed toward the massive weapon, now charging for its first shot. "It's designed to drain magical essence, but if we can reverse the polarity, it'll pump energy back into the forest instead of out of it." Ferris felt pieces clicking together in his mind. But someone would have to get inside the firing chamber, reprogram the spell matrices while it's active. Myra's expression was grim. It would be suicide. Around them, the battle raged with increasing fury. Bramble had multiplied herself somehow, or perhaps it was just that her rage had reached the point where she could be in 6 places at once, her claws finding purchase in steel and flesh with equal ease. But for every machine she destroyed, 2 more took its place. The consortium had committed to total victory, and they had the resources to achieve it. That's when Elder Oakenheart fell. The ancient treant had been holding the center line, his massive form shrugging off everything the humans could throw at him. But concentrated fire from 3 devastators finally found its mark, their drills boring through heartwood that had stood for millennia. The treant's death scream was the sound of a library burning, of songs that would never be sung again. Bramble's responding roar shattered windows in the mining camp 2 miles away. She abandoned all pretense of strategy, threw herself at the nearest group of soldiers with the single-minded fury of a natural disaster. Her claws found flesh. Her magic turned their own weapons against them, and for a moment it seemed like pure rage might be enough to win the day. But rage alone couldn't stop the scorched earth cannon from achieving firing readiness. The weapon's charge cycle completed with a sound like reality taking a deep breath. Magical energy crackled along its length, building toward a release that would burn the magical essence from 50 square miles of forest. Everything living, everything that had ever been magical, everything that could ever become magical, all of it would be reduced to ash and empty space. Now or never, Ferris muttered, and began running toward the cannon. He made it halfway before Grimwold's security team spotted him. Suppression bolts sizzled past his head, leaving afterimages that tasted of copper and regret. One clipped his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the corrupted mud. Traitor! Grimwold stood over him, a military-grade spell focus in his hand. Did you really think you could sabotage months of work, years of planning? Actually, Ferris spat blood from his mouth. I was counting on it. Grimwold's expression shifted to confusion, then alarm, as he realized what Ferris meant. While they'd been talking, Myra had reached the cannon. She was inside the firing chamber now, her hands dancing over spell matrices that hummed with barely contained destruction. Stop her, Grimwold screamed, but it was too late. The cannon fired. But instead of sterilizing the forest, it pumped every erg of stored magical energy directly into the surviving trees, the poisoned streams, the corrupted earth itself. The blast was visible from orbit, a pillar of pure thaumic force that reached toward the heavens like the finger of an awakening god. The explosion that followed redrew the local map. Ferris woke to the sound of singing. Not human voices, something older, stranger, like wind through leaves that remembered what music used to be. He opened his eyes to find himself lying in soft grass that definitely hadn't been there when the scorched earth cannon fired. Above him, a canopy of unfamiliar trees filtered sunlight that seemed somehow greener than it should be. Easy, little builder. The voice came from beside him, and when he turned his head, he saw something that made his brain struggle to process what his eyes were reporting. Bramble Ironbark sat cross-legged in the grass, but she was different. The corruption that had twisted her bark skin into silver veins was still there, but it had been transformed into something beautiful rather than terrible. Where once the metal had pulsed with poisonous energy, it now glowed with a soft light that complemented rather than fought her natural magic. What happened? His voice came out as a croak. The cannon worked exactly as intended. Her smile was no longer the expression of a predator evaluating prey. Myra's sacrifice gave us a chance to heal rather than simply rage. The forest chose growth over vengeance. Ferris struggled to sit up, his body protesting every movement. Around him, he could see the results of that choice. The thornwood was growing back, but it was different now. Organic curves wrapped around the skeletal remains of mining equipment, turning industrial debris into the bones of a new ecosystem. Trees grew in patterns that followed the old ley lines, but their roots now incorporated crystalline formations that pulsed with hybrid magic, part natural, part industrial, entirely unprecedented. The others, he asked. Bramble's expression darkened. Grimwold died in the blast. Most of his soldiers fled when they realized what was happening. A few stayed to help with the wounded. Her tone suggested she found their sudden change of heart interesting rather than surprising. Humans are remarkably adaptable when their survival depends on it. And Myra. See for yourself. Bramble gestured toward a grove of trees that hadn't existed minutes ago. At their center stood a figure that might have been human, if humans glowed with soft green light and had hair that moved like leaves in a breeze that touched nothing else. Myra looked up from the seedling she was tending, and her smile was the expression of someone who had found their true calling. The magical feedback changed her, Bramble explained. She's something new now, neither fully human nor completely spirit, but a bridge between both worlds. Ferris pulled himself to his feet, marveling at how good the air smelled. Clean in a way he'd forgotten was possible, but with undertones of metal and industry that suggested the forest hadn't simply rejected human influence. It had learned to incorporate it. What about the rest of the forest, the corruption? Gone, but not forgotten. Bramble rose with fluid grace, her form more stable than it had been during their previous encounters. We used the cannon's energy to burn out the poison, but we kept the lessons it taught us. Adaptation is survival, and the forest has always been skilled at survival. She led him to the edge of the grove, where the view opened onto what had once been the mining camp. The industrial infrastructure was still there, but it had been transformed. Crystalline growths that looked part plant, part technology formed organic networks between the buildings. Workers moved through the complex with purpose, but their tools now pulsed with the same hybrid energy that flowed through the transformed trees. They call it environmental integration, Bramble said, noting his expression. Myra's new field of study, how to make industry and nature work together instead of fighting each other. Will it last? Ferris asked. This peace between the forest and the humans. Bramble's laugh was the sound of wind chimes made from living wood. Peace. Little builder, there is no peace in nature, only balance. The forest will keep growing, humans will keep building. Sometimes we'll fight, sometimes we'll cooperate, but we'll never stop changing. She pointed toward the horizon, where smoke rose from distant cities, but it was clean smoke now, infused with magic that cleaned the air rather than poisoning it. Your people are already adapting the hybrid technology. Within a generation, your cities will be as much forest as building. Within 2, your children will grow up thinking trees that sing and machines that photosynthesize are perfectly normal. And the spirits, the ones who were corrupted, learning to be themselves again but different. Bramble's expression grew thoughtful. The rust sprites have become maintenance spirits. They tend the hybrid systems, keep the balance between organic and mechanical. The corrupted dryads are teaching humans how to sing to their machines, how to make technology that dreams. As if summoned by her words, a small figure emerged from the undergrowth. It looked like one of the rust sprites, but the harsh angles had been softened, the mechanical precision replaced by something more organic. When it saw Ferris, it chirped in a voice like wind through grass. Bildermanbridge Walker, come see, the new growth needs tending. Ferris followed the little spirit through the transformed grove, marveling at the sights around him. Trees whose leaves were solar collectors fed energy to root networks that powered water purification systems. Flowers that bloomed in mathematical patterns provided navigation data to any creature that asked. Everywhere he looked, the boundary between natural and artificial had become meaningless. It's beautiful, he said and meant it. It's survival, Bramble corrected. Beauty is just what survival looks like when it's working properly. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the forest's new song, a harmony of bird calls and machine hums, of wind through leaves and data flowing through crystal networks. It was strange, alien, nothing like the world Ferris had grown up in. It was also unmistakably alive. As they reached a clearing where human workers and forest spirits labored side by side to plant hybrid seedlings, Bramble turned to him with something that might have been approval. "So, little builder, what will you build next?" Ferris looked at the transformed world around him, at the impossible beauty of industry and nature finding harmony, at the future growing from the ashes of old conflicts. He thought about his grandmother's stories, about forests that sang and spirits that tended the wild places with gentle hands. Maybe some stories didn't have to end. Maybe some could just begin again, different but still true. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think I'd like to find out." Bramble's smile was fierce and proud and full of the promise of seasons yet to come. "Then welcome to the new world, Ferris Coalwright. Try not to break this one." The forest laughed around them, a sound like wind through leaves that had learned to dream of tomorrow. And in that laughter was the promise that some things, love, hope, the stubborn refusal to give up, would always find a way to grow, no matter how much the world changed around them. Even if it had to grow in entirely new directions.